Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. On April 8th, 2024, all manner of sky gazers across North America will lift their protected eyes up to behold an extraordinary celestial event, a total solar eclipse. It won't be the first in recent years. In fact, the last one whose path crossed the STLPR listening area was in 2017. Getting another so soon, and one that'll last almost a whole 4 minutes, is a rarity indeed. But solar eclipse watching is no new thing. Humans have kept watch, kept track, and kept trying to understand what solar eclipses mean for millennia. Manel Errando is assistant professor of physics at Washington University, who will be giving a talk this Saturday morning about that, and he joins us now to offer a preview of it. Manel, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for inviting me.
Now, you dove into what historical writings can tell us about some of the first recorded solar eclipses in human history. What was the earliest recorded solar eclipse?
So the first recorded solar eclipse that we have knowledge of, it was recorded by Chinese astronomers, and it's dated to year 2137 BC. Mm-hmm. So it's more than 4,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it was recorded in it was in the time of the Xia dynasty, mm-hmm. and they had a book of records that they call the Xia Shu, which I think it translates to the book of the dynasty of the Xia, mm-hmm. and they recorded this event, and in particular they recorded this event because they were keeping track of eclipses to basically keep track of their calendar, mm-hmm. right? Because there is a sort of periodicity to this, to how the moon and the sun and the earth move, mm-hmm. so that every about 18 years, the sun, the moon, and the earth are more or less at the same spot. So every 18 years, kind of the whole cycle goes back to where it was, mm-hmm. and that would keep their calendars on track. So these astronomers were trying to predict this eclipse, and they kind of missed it. And that's why this one, it looks like that's the reason why this one went on the record.
Right. So when you say kind of missed it, what were the circumstances surrounding that?
Well, so the story says that these two astronomers of the court, it looks like they were out drinking instead of having been doing their calculations about when the eclipse would happen. And then when the eclipse happened and they had not notified the emperor that this eclipse would happen and they had failed to make the prediction, let's say that the emperor wasn't very happy about it.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, I think it is important too to talk about what they were expected to do during the eclipse. And it had to do with warding off evil and danger.
Yes, so I think eclipses have been always associated with, usually more often than not, with bad things happening rather than good things happening.
Sure.
And it sort of makes sense to think about, so if we think about the earliest humans that were basically nomads and living off of nature, it made a lot of sense for them to be looking at the sky, because you can get a lot of good information if you're looking at the sky. Mm-hmm. The moon and the sun are our first calendars, and if you're living off of the land, it's of course very important to know when the seasons are changing, when your hunting is going to be better in certain areas, when it's going to get colder, when you need to store food. So they were keeping track of these patterns in the sky, like the sun rising higher in summer and going lower in winter, and trying to make predictions mm-hmm. out of it. And that was very useful for them. But at the same time, there's things that happen in the sky that are not related to the seasons or to our calendar, like, for instance, solar eclipses or comets or sometimes, I don't know, stars go into explosions and there is a nova. So there's a new star that shows up in the sky that you didn't know. And because they were so well trained to finding patterns, then probably they thought, oh, these weird things that are happening that are not as predictable, they may have coincidentally happened when something bad happened to the community, and then those associations stayed in there, and that happened to eclipses. So for in most cultures, lunar eclipses and solar eclipses were usually bad omens and a sign that something bad would happen, and then they would have their rituals to protect themselves for these potentially bad things.
And then the rituals involved doing things to ward off.
Yeah, yes. So there's different interpretations about what the eclipses were. I think so. One of the ones that I found, for example, in Chinese culture, was what there was a dragon that would be eating up the sun, and they would try to protect the sun from this dragon that was eating it, because of course they needed the sun because it's important for living. Yeah.
Right. And so ultimately what happened with those astronomers were that they were...
Yeah, so eventually, again, the emperor wasn't very pleased about them having missed the prediction of the eclipse. So they were executed, it looks like. Yeah.
Now, there are other examples as well. And one of the most famous ancient solar eclipses was recorded. This was in 585 BCE in Anatolia, present-day Turkey, during a battle between the Medes people and the Lydians. What is it that we know about that day, Manel?
So we know from later reports from historians, from Herodotus in particular, that apparently the two armies went into battle that day. And towards the end of the day, they say, I mean, the record says that the sun disappeared from the sky and the day turned into night, which it's very easy to interpret as a solar eclipse happening. And basically, the two armies were kind of paralyzed by the event, and they decided to work on a peace treaty that actually set the river where this happened as the border between the two nations for a few years.
And the Greek philosopher Thales of Miletus came to some renown after this, right?
Yes, and it was because, again, according to records, he had predicted, he had warned the armies that there would be an eclipse happening in that region at that time. And at least the archaeoastronomers that study these type of events, there is no consensus on whether he could have predicted it or not. But at least there's historical records that says that he did. And of course, if you are able to predict an event that's so rare, that made him
famous.
Basically. Yeah. More famous than what he already was.
Mm-hmm. Now, you did mention that there were many cultures and civilizations in which eclipses were regarded as inauspicious signs. What were a couple of those civilizations, and what details can you sort of share to help us understand how they were dealing with or managing these events?
Yeah. So one of the examples that I like the most is what was happening in Mesopotamian cultures or the Assyrians. So we're talking about between, 2000 BC and 6000 BC, so a while ago. And they were very good astronomers and astrologers, so they were keeping track of everything that was happening in the sky. And they had this, they thought that, again, solar eclipses and lunar eclipses would be a bad omen and something bad would happen. And in particular, they thought that something bad would happen to the king. Mm-hmm. So a total solar eclipse is pretty rare, right? But partial solar eclipses are not that rare. They happen more often because they cross a wider swath of the Earth. Mm-hmm. And so for partial solar eclipses, depending on what part of the sun was being kind of bitten by the moon in this case, mm-hmm. They had divided their kingdom in 4 regions, and depending on what part was being obscured, they would think that king was the one that was in danger. But they had a set of rules. Like, for example, they said if there's a solar eclipse, but Venus and Jupiter are in the sky, then the king is safe. But probably the enemy will attack us. Okay. So they had a series of rules. And whenever there was a solar eclipse where Venus and Jupiter were not in the sky, and then that meant that the king was not safe. Mm-hmm. One thing that some kings thought was, well, then maybe now that this eclipse happened and something bad's going to happen to me, I'll step down, and they would put someone from the court as the king for a while. And then, again, to protect the whole community from the bad omen that the eclipse was signaling, they would sacrifice the king, which was the substitute king, right?
Right.
So that is it's recorded. There's several records of that happening, and there's one record of a king that was the king of the Assyrians around year 1800 BC, where the king stepped down, they put a substitute king, but then apparently the king died during those days, according to the records, because he was eating soup that was too hot. Okay. I'm not sure what's the danger. I always tend to eat my soup colder, just to make sure that I'm not on the safe side. But the actual king died, and then the person that had just stepped up, who was probably the gardener of the court, he continued to rule, and he was the king until he died, hopefully of natural causes.
Mm-hmm. So I'm chuckling over this. When people hear these stories, how do they respond? I mean, is it mostly incredulity, or do they relate with it in some way?
I think so. Like some of these, some of the material that I'll talk about on Saturday is material that I developed for an astronomy class. And whenever we went into historical events or events that had more to do with culture, the students tended to like it because it makes it more relatable, right? If we are telling you to study how the moon and the sun move, yeah, that's interesting. But if you can see how it relates to events of cultural or historical significance, usually people are a bit more excited about it.
We're speaking with Professor Manel Errando, who is an assistant professor of physics at Washington University, and we're talking about our understanding of solar eclipses over time in human history, how it's affected culture, and how we do things. So, understanding over time, I mean, generally speaking, how is it that human understanding of eclipses has changed, and what has really been the thing that has driven a deeper understanding?
So I think the understanding of eclipses is linked to our understanding of the cosmos, right? And we know that, for example, in ancient Greece, there were philosophers at the time that were ensured that the Earth was the center of the universe. So most civilizations, they tended to put the Earth at the center of the universe, and then have the moon rotating around the Earth, the sun moving around the Earth, and the stars moving around. So then in that kind of primitive way of understanding the cosmos, usually in cultures it was more linked to the deities that they had at the time. They would have a deity for the sun, a deity for the moon, and then when, for example, in Chinese records, we know that they are talking about an eclipse because they say, well, at that time the sun and the moon, they were no longer how did it say? They were no longer living peacefully in the sky, right? So it's kind of a battle between different deities. But of course, later on with for instance, Ptolemy, which was an astronomer that made very precise records of the motions of the Earth, the sun, and the moon, and the planets, then it was understood that basically the eclipse is actually the moon blocking the sun. And then, of course, with Copernicus kind of shifting the Earth from the center of the universe and putting the sun at the center, that also changes a little bit our understanding.
So when is it that scientists started forming then a more accurate understanding of what a total solar eclipse is?
That's a good question. I would think probably in the Greek era with philosophers that were already understanding that probably the Earth was moving around the sun and the moon was moving around the Earth, and the Earth was carrying the moon around the sun. But I'm not 100% sure when that was kind of first established.
To bring it a little bit closer to our time, there was a solar eclipse in 1919, and it is credited with rocketing Albert Einstein to fame. How so, Manel?
So that eclipse in 1919, Arthur Eddington, who was a British astronomer and physicist, he basically wanted to test the theory of general relativity from Einstein, which basically Einstein says that gravity is basically a feature that we see because space-time or space is curved, right? And then there was this prediction that the sun, because it's a very massive object, it would curve space, and then the light from stars would bend as it was going around the sun. So, of course, we cannot observe stars behind the sun because the sun is so bright and the stars are so much dimmer. But then they thought, well, during a solar eclipse, the disk of the sun is blocked, and I will be able to see the stars behind the sun. And if the stars have shifted their position a little bit, then I will know that Einstein's right.
Right.
So they did. They mounted a couple of expeditions in different spots to make sure that they would be able to see the total solar eclipse, and they took pictures and they measured the positions of the stars, and they showed that in fact the stars had shifted,
right,
and that the light was being bent by the mass of the sun, and that Einstein was right, and then the way we understand gravity was basically, or the way gravity works was the way that Einstein was promulgating, which was a bit funny politically because Eddington, being a British astronomer, he was basically proving Einstein right, which was a German physicist, and proving Newton wrong, which was a very famous British physicist. So there was also politics involved in those expeditions.
Now, today, we know so much more about total solar eclipses than we have for most of human history. How is it that eclipses help advance our scientific understanding in the 21st century?
So we know, for example, helium, the element helium, was discovered during a solar eclipse in the 19th century, actually. And also all these historical records of that we have of when and where an eclipse happened, they have helped us, for example, to measure that the Earth is spinning a little bit, so that the Earth is spinning slower and slower, so that basically the days are growing longer and longer as time goes on. We have records that say, well, at this day, on this particular position, there was an eclipse, but then when we did the simulations and we go back, we find that the position is a little bit off, and the reason to explain it is that the Earth spin speed has changed slightly, and the best measurements that we have of that effect are from historical records of eclipses.
Now, we had opened the show by saying on April 8th there will be a total solar eclipse. Will you, Manel, be among those looking up at the sky then?
I'll definitely will.
And as a physicist, and then also just as a human being living here, what is it that excites you about that forthcoming event?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to be able to see the last eclipse that happened in this area in 2017. That was the first time that I saw a total solar eclipse.
Oh, okay.
And it's really spectacular. Well, first because it's also kind of a community event. Like you are there with people and everyone is looking at this one thing.
Right.
And then also, I think that, I don't know, short of being able to go on a spacecraft and seeing the Earth from outer space, a solar eclipse shows us basically how the universe works. It's kind of in that very precise moment. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Manel Errando is Assistant Professor of Physics at Washington University in St. Louis. Manel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
This episode was produced by Emily Woodbury.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.